I'm so glad he's here. He touches upon multiple things and is globally renowned. So we are very glad to have him. Just in a minute, and I was really touched by Sajan Mani's wake-up call from my ancestors. That thing really hit me hard, right? So it's just a very problematic thing. We are not interested in unraveling the history of the oppressed from their own terms, for their own sake. So we call them as untouchables, now we call them ex-untouchables. How glorious it is. But we don't care to ask who they are. How do they see themselves? What is that positive history and culture? Positive history and culture with an untouchable? Ex-untouchable? That's how we go, right? Absolutely wrong. But on the other hand, for Brahmins in South Asia, they have a glorious history. That's why I begin to speak now. Brahmin is not a good category. The moment I say I'm a Brahmin, I am a casteist. So everything under the Brahmin has to be questioned. So in that sense, Sanal Mohan Mansi, when he asks us to think about, wake up call from my ancestors, he doesn't mean the negative history of his ancestors. He means the history of the oppressed and marginalized women and men. To think about that history, positive cultural aspects and so on. And Sajan is a great, great artist, and he's going to impact us globally in more ways than what we know so far. So it's beautiful to have you all here. I stop here and let Sanal Mohan speak. Thanks.
Now, when Dr. Getendran today spoke about the kind of positive history, so I just thought about some words which was shared with me by some of our colleagues in terms of the technologies or which are related to the technologies of the caste oppressed communities. So we have here Dr. Narayan, who is working on the basket weavers of South India, and he was very kind to share one of his papers, which actually deals with this particular craft of basket weaving. So we have there are these examples of commodity production, and the operation happens largely because of the involvement in commodity production, and often enough those things are produced for the market. But if you, as he has done, Madhu Narayan is here, as he has done, he goes back in time to talk about the specific technologies and how it evolved and how it connects with agrarian classes and castes. Primarily making objects as well as the artifacts for storing up grain. And also taking those grains to market and also storing up other agricultural produce. So this is a fantastic example when we want to talk about the sort of positive histories that we have been talking about. And the other one which I have discussed in my paper is some kind of call by scholars based in this part of the world, particularly scholars who work in the area of slavery of Southwest India, largely Kerala, using the materials of the Dutch East India Company archives. So one of these recent books, which is titled as Testimonials to Slavery, wherein they talked about the urgent need for historical research. So that was something very much interesting to me. Need for urgent research in the area of slavery as far as Southwest India is concerned. So therefore, when Sajan and his colleagues began to think about the possibilities of the wake-up call, so I just thought about what are the ways in which we can really think about this particular idea of wake-up call. So at one level we have the question of archive, and I'm referring to Sajan, who is an artist who actually deals with archival materials. Unlike those of us who are in history, social anthropology, or critical social sciences who labor in the archives. And we have a different kind of relationship with archive, and I may draw your attention to the very fertile debate on this question. On the one side, we have South Asians like Dalit who had fine-tuned this whole enterprise of history writing based on archive, and basically talking about the process of counterinsurgency, which is one of the titles of his essays, where actually he had taken up this question. The other genre is ant storer, which is again quite famous among historians and other social scientists, wherein we talk about against the grain, reading against the grain and along the grain. So therefore, there are different ways in which the colonial archive has been looked at. Now, Sajan's intervention and particularly this conversation this evening, and the kind of artworks which are on display really challenges this enterprise of writing critical history from a different vantage point, which is what Wake-up Call is all about. So now I look at what are the implications of this particular thing. Now, those of us who do research, as my friend Dr. Ayadure just mentioned, those of us working in the area of South Asian history, with subaltern studies and the critiques that it had produced, it gave rise to, and also feminist interventions in the writing of South Asian histories, and social sciences. Today we have a very substantial kind of writings on this particular question of either trying to retrieve the lost voices. Obviously, there are limits to such a project, or trying to identify with a certain kind of historical past, etc., and allowing these historical agents to speak. So those projects have been there. But the difference now, as we are encountering this wake-up call, is to see how much, in both ways, as Dr. Ayadure said, we can have a look at positive history. Like many people try to show, which I am also following now, what was the significance of these enslaved communities of past oppressed people in South Asia, who were who actually worked as laborers in the field. I think in conventional economics and sociology, such people could be referred to as, unskilled laborers. But when it comes to, I'll just give an example. So sometimes I reproduce a statement made by one of these scholars who once said that one plant which was consistently against Dalits in India and South Asia were it was just like a question he was throwing at us. To name a plant which was against Dalits. So we couldn't be labored, but we failed, and we said we are not in a position to give the answer. And he said it is rice. Obviously, we are most people there are rice eaters, and I think we don't get that much rice now. The last couple of days. But the point is, rice was such a labor-intensive problem, which actually led to the enslavement of millions of people across the historical period. So there, as we all lovingly call him, he is a botanist actually, and then moved into history writing and so on, from Madras Christian College. So he said, well, it was rice, and it thanks to technological changes, which is very different now. Now, if you look at from what my friend Dr. Ayadure talked about, a positive side of this history, not positive. Well, we will say that look here, the whole technology of rice cultivation was known to the Pulayas and Parayas in Kerala, and similar parts in the Tamil region or Telugu region and so on. So if you really want to write the history of drawing from what my friend Madhunarayan has done in terms of this technology of basket weaving community. And I guess we can write a fantastic history of this rice production where agential action is not given to those landlords to control the means of production, but the people who really, I'm not saying that those things are not important. As someone who did some political economy, I know those things are important. But then what I'm saying is that this whole idea of, tending the crops, and also, looking at, the rice plant growing up, the people could say, very experienced agricultural laborer could say what was ailing those plants. So we have a variety of narratives of that kind, and then we find similar things being articulated in literary imagination. So I have in my mind this. Now, English translation is available of a very fantastic novel in Malayalam, which was written in 1962, which was titled as Pulayatara, which means the heart of Pulayas. And the English translation also retained the Malayalam original title, Pulayatara, wherein the author Paul Chirakarod actually talks about this particular intimacy of Pulayas with the rice plant. And then saying that how much was his or her knowledge of the rice fields, knowledge of the crop, various stages in the growth of this rice plant. So there are a lot more of that. Now I think this is one example of, if we want to write a history of that, it's quite positive, and we have wonderful examples in that sense, like Ajendra Subramanian has shown to us. If there are any more, skeptics with regard to the question of merit in Indian institutions, so she had shown fantastically that this was a myth invented recently, and she had done this great fieldwork in IIT Madras to show how much hollow this whole thing was. So the question is, if you want to put the positive side of that sort of an experience, let us bring to the fore, let us put it on our tables, this sort of abilities of the oppressed caste people who were actual producers of these commodities, all sorts of commodities. And as in another context, I still have this particular sentence from Paul Gilroy when he said that, well, wealth creation was the central question as far as the blacks were concerned. I think the same kind of situation existed as we have our own colleagues working across these questions of caste, gender, and race. This sort of intersectionalities. I think that is worth pondering over. Now, I think I have some 6 minutes.
Thank you, Sir.
Am I right? All right. So I am not going to read this whole thing. So therefore, my whole thing. Actually, I wrote so much about this very depressing kind of stories. So I thought, that is another side of the wake-up call. Mutilating the bodies, killing, torture, burying alive, splitting the blood of these people, cutting throat, and all these things, which were actually I'm looking at historical source materials as someone trained in historical research. I want to show that look, it is how in archives we have this information. I wanted to show that. Now then, attention to my wings out of this state. So therefore, I'm back to that. So I appreciate that. So therefore, I have this, stories of how people face this everyday forms of violence, and then which is followed by this stories of everyday forms of violence would be followed by questions of love, questions of families, longing, and many ways in which people would be reproducing the lives. And there I connect with some of the debates we have in political social sciences today. I took this example, which is again connected with questions of technology and uh, the ways in which you can really bring a different kind of narrative. So I will give the example of house construction. Now, my impression, I don't know, probably it was same in the rest of South India as well. Mostly Dalits were never allowed to use durable materials for constructing houses. So therefore, every household will be constructing with the help of their own relatives their small parts. So there is a certain kind of architectural knowledge which thus accrued by these communities. And now I connect this with some of the arguments of Arjuna Pavile in his very interesting book about the future as a cultural fact. So when I don't know if I'm correct. The future as a cultural fact. So when he talks about the significance of having a roof, but he uses it in the very modern urban context of the slums in Mumbai, Bombay. So he says that if you have even if it is a plastic kind of shack, it means a lot. And if those shacks are divided into rooms, again used by plastic curtains, which means that the whole idea of privacy has kept in. And then that is a place where meanings of life are introduced. Now I'm just taking this idea back in time to see how historically the construction of huts, etc., would be very, very significant. And then I connect this with very interesting, one of those interesting arguments of historian Michael Roche from France. I think he is one of those anal historians who wrote a very interesting book, A History of Everyday Things. So and then I'm connecting, I just drew on that particular work to talk about how Dalit households, how the oppressed caste people actually developed this whole idea of consumption of commodities. So I just checked my notes of the 2015 when we did field work among elderly Dalit Christians. So we spoke with an elderly woman from my own village in the northern part of Kerala. She said back in the 1950s, they had few coconut shells, spoons, and a couple of pots, and a few more earthenware. So that formed, along with the screw pine mattress, the entire assets of a Pulaya household. No matter what religion, whether he is a Christian or a non-Christian, this was the assets that these people would have. Then I checked some of the writings of the 1930s, late 30s, one economist based in this southern part of Kerala. He exactly, after his field work, talked about the conditions of the Pulaya Christians exactly the same way. So therefore, then I just go back in time to 1850s and further back in time. So I find that if we take a history of consumption in that sense, we hardly find changes happening. I don't know how do we change. There is something like a long 18th century, because as I said in the beginning, as I was interested in political economy, we used to talk about long 19th century. Well, here you have a long 18th century or further back in time, wherein you find, not even subterranean movements were taking place. I just borrow one word from the anal historians. How we are not seeing even that sort of things are happening in a big way when it comes to the everyday experiences of the list. So in the last 1 minute, so I just leave my traumatic histories behind to talk about how structurally we encountered this. So therefore, the wake up call, I will do this. Actually marking the unmarked graves that can be identified in the backwaters or on the plantations or on the dryland farms of various regions of Kerala. Because I work with the materials generated in Kerala or related to Kerala. through other kinds of historical context and to talk about how the new imaginations have been created and how it actually gives us a lot of things to think about. Nice talk there. Thank you very much.
Super.
It's of course as part of the weight of course for my ancestors here on here. And in fact, I'm a little bit hesitant to speak after Professor Sajan Mani because he presented it here in a very well-structured way, his arguments, and placed all things together in a well-structured, attractive way. And to be frank, it's not possible for me to do things that way because I am a little bit diffident one way, and on the other side, whenever I face a situation like this, I face the question: am I an academic or a art writer or something like that, or am I the thinking together partner of Sajan Mani in this project, or am I just a researcher who is doing some research paper or some research work related to archives? So that is the confusion I am facing now, just now. About my topic, I would like to begin with Kritika's work, Kritika Kane's work. It is about making an archive out of found objects related to Dalit lives. Dalit lives, that's quite familiar to her. The question is it an archive? Or what makes an archive? What is the archival value? That is the first question we face when we are in a situation like this. As you know, I think, I don't know whether she's somewhere here, as very recently Katya Muller observed, following Foucault, an archive is in fact a group of statements about expectations. Or in other words, an archive is a statement of expectations. Before the beginning of an archive or before the compiling of archival objects, you have your expectations and you try to realize those expectations via your archive. And the second question we face whenever we refer to an archival material from South Asia is that whether it is authentic or not. What makes an archive authentic? For instance, the oldest document related to the history of Kerala is Teresa Pali. It's a copper plate. A copper plate that was supposed to be written in 9th century. And all the caste oppressions and all the things related to caste, especially the discrimination against lower caste people, have some connection to that document. Because it's a casteist document. It's about certain king giving certain rights to upper caste people, especially upper caste Christians. They were later known as Syrian Christians. It's a very wrong term. No connection with Syria or nothing ethnographic or anthropological connected to Syria or something like that. But still they are known as Syrian Christians, a name given by the Dutch East India Company's people. In fact, they found this copper plate supposedly from some depot in Fort Kochi, and they presented it as a very, very authentic kind of archival material. And that archival material is treated as one of the unchallengeably authentic materials related to Kerala history, especially early Kerala history. So, the question of the authenticity of archive is always there whenever we do some artistic project related to archives. And the artist's answer is to unarchived things. Unarchived things. In Europe, we do have, as you know, have a very systematic kind of archival practice that has both these things like weatherproof and archive boxes, and those things are inaccessible to most of the people, as in the case of the things we deal now, around 12,000 images and 2,000 objects are there in the archive, but only 300 or so images are available for us. and all other materials and other objects are safe in the custody of the archive or the museum. But in India, we know, and in many parts of the world, people have the habit of keeping precious things by burying them. As she did in her work, there is of course earth and soil in anything that is precious to you. Even my grandparents used to keep precious things by burying them somewhere inside the house. So we have this kind of archival practice. It is quite opposite to the archival practice of the West, where things are safe, objects are safe, but here objects are open to destruction, objects are open to what it is called weather. So this is really two approaches to the archive. And here the artists, as well as Rajeshwari and Kritika and Sajan, and similarly Upendran also engage archive in a very inauthentic, completely out of a garden way. So this is the most important aspect about this project. So about the insufficiency of European archives as reference points or as reference materials also is there when we engage very intimately with things like personal history or the caste discrimination faced by ancestors in the past. Because if you go through these photographs and the objects, definitely the eugenic kind of case is there, the ethnographic case is there, and so many types of colonial prejudices are in operation, even now, even when we access these things. And similarly, as Sajan mentioned in one of his conversations, the issue of copyright also is operating in a very oppressive way when we try to access these things. When we want to reproduce an image that really belongs to me or you or someone else, we face the issue of copyright. Okay? Whenever it is used in some kind of artwork, there is this issue of copyright. Whose copyright is this? Or who is the real owner? Who is the real legal kind of what it is called? The person who entitled to use it. That is the big question faced by people like Sajan when they engage with this sort of things. And so many things are there about the photographic representation and the question of exactitude in photography. The exactitude in photography is a big question that we have to engage. Similarly, the optical pleasure, in fact, that also is there via online sharing and Instagram posts and Facebook posts. There is, a trend in Kerala among our friends now to share all these things on Facebook, Instagram, etc., etc. So the optical pleasure and visual truth are other issues connected to this sort of artistic archival practice. And I would like to stop this by asking a few questions that may be, very helpful for me to do something related to this work after this panel discussion. Question number 1, are the archives powerful enough to hold your ancestors in photographs? Are the archives powerful enough to hold your ancestors in photographs? Can the archives release them on our access request? Do the ancestors live in the archives in photographs? So the question is, can we make a wake-up call for our ancestors when they are kept in the safe custody in the European kind of museum kind of spaces? So, I think in Sajan's imagination, archive is of course like a sleeping puppet, and the wake-up call is what we should do right now. So these are the questions finally I raised after going through these things. Thank you for your
thank you, Anthony. Like you, I also work in Tamil Nadu. I think Anthony has raised a very important question about the archives. The written is privileged, and the discursive aspects are privileged over the non-discursive aspects. In a way, it connects with Sanal also. How do we understand these indigenous technologies of Indians, South Asians? So, did a Brahmin ever invent anything connected with common people of India? Is a very important question that I've been grappling with. I'm frontally attacking. The moment I say, as I said in the beginning of my talk, the moment I say I'm a Brahmin, I'm an exclusionary person. So could I ever create something that would be inclusive of all of you? I don't think it's possible. On the contrary, like Sanal said, like Anthony is also pointing out, rice production, wheat production, everything. This in my last speech, in one of the talks, I said that everything a Brahmin eats is literally produced by the people who he or she is attacking as untouchable. The rice, I began with the word rice, to what Sanal said. Rice, wheat, vegetables, meat, fish, everything is produced by the people I oppress. I call them untouchables. I don't even leave their body. Sexually, I oppress them. Right? Just see the data. So in that sense, on the one hand, people are classified as untouchable. Every day, girls and women can't even go and pee in India. That's the situation. They are mutilated. So this is how do we understand, how do we recover? And then on the other hand, the archives are legitimizing in a very glorified way, in which, if Sajan or others are trying to say, no, it's not accessible. So for who is this archive in Europe, in the US, right? On the other hand, it's the case in India too. In all the archives where I got gone in India, very terrible disappointment. The moment I said I want to work on caste, archives were hidden from me in Chennai, in Delhi and elsewhere. So I had to go around and beat around the bush and extract things. So that's a state of, so in a way they're pointing it out how archive is sort of regimented, especially when you are trying to recover the positive history of the oppressed Indians from European and American archives. We understand about India, the privileged groups control that. But what about here? So you are open to so-called pretentiously raised question, but you want to glorify the Brahminical culture of India, right? And you will not let anti-caste activists and artists like Sajan Mani and others, the anti-caste Indians like us, we are not accessible to that. So this has to be questioned. Privileged groups can have access to beauty and not others. So this has to be stopped. Thank you, Anthony, for boldly raising these questions. We will think about that and get back to you. Now, I think, I don't know whether Vinil has come back. Is Vinil Paul is around? Is yet to come. Okay, so let him come. Meanwhile, I think I will invite Habiba, who is a PhD scholar here, and she works on multiple aspects in Humboldt University about South Asia, about the politics of display. Amazing. I think that's a new intervention. What do you display from South Asia that will be catchy and attractive? But you don't care about the hierarchization and marginalization and opposite, right? For example, the phrase like Hindu culture. Could there be anything? I'm not very sure. If you put the pillar called caste, could there be anything called Hindu? By the way, the word Hindu was not even popular in the early 20th century. As a 10th grader, I saw the Hindu on my certificate. I went home and asked my parents. They didn't have a clue about that word. I don't belong to that tradition. That was imposed on me. And I refute that and reject that. So I think that way Habiba's role is very important in understanding what is displaced, and we are galvanized by it. We are fortunate to have you here, Habiba. So thank you for joining us. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a short slide presentation with these images. So I think I'll just stand. Okay. Okay, so thank you first of all for presenting me with this opportunity to share some of my ongoing research with you. So So I'm a PhD student and I'm working on the display as you mentioned, and so I am looking at the Indian objects here in Berlin museums, which are essentially in the Ethnological Museum, the Asian Art Museum, and the Museum of Islamic Art. So my questions for the archive, I am looking at how were they created, who created them, and what implications do we have for these archives today. So I'm going to just briefly right now talk to you about one way in which objects came. There were multiple ways, but I'm going to just start with one way in which objects came to these museums, to these archives, and then what happened with them, how were they displayed, how were they classified, and so on. Now, the 19th century was an era of unprecedented collecting, enabled by growing European colonialism and imperialism. The size of museum collections in Europe grew very rapidly. During this time, a large corpus of objects from India were collected for the ethnological collections of the Berlin Royal Museums. Now, one popular way in which these objects came to Berlin museums were through scientific expeditions, as they were called. So now let me just sketch one of these scientific expeditions. Now in 1882, Emil Riebeck, who was an explorer, collector, and chemist, traveled to India as part of his 2-year-long globe-trotting expedition. Now his trip generated hundreds of ethnographic, anthropological, and zoological objects from West Asia, Africa, India, and East Asia. Now Riebeck's ethnological collections from India were especially outstanding. He collected a wide sample of wicker work from nearly all the places he traveled to. He purchased dozens of lifelike hand-modeled clay figures from a place called Krishna Nagar in West Bengal, which you can see here, which depicted different Indian communities garbed in traditional attire and at work. He also managed to get hold of fine bronze vases from Banaras, ritual devil masks, as they were called, from Ceylon, and exquisite silver work from Kashmir. Now, apart from a large number of handicrafts and industrial products that he got with him, he also brought back numerous photographs, some which he took himself, of the many people that he saw, as well as of the landscape of India. Now, however, Riebeck's most noteworthy contribution from this trip was the material that he gathered of the highly interesting tribe of the districts and highlands of Chittagong, which is, I don't know if you can see it, but it's at the bottom right, that side, which is today a part of Bangladesh. Now, Riebeck's journey generated a lot of excitement, since this region of Chittagong was a relatively unexplored region of British India, and little was known about its inhabitants except that they lived in the most primitive natural state. Now, moreover, collection of neither ethnic nor anthropological material of these hill tribes was to be found in any museum in Europe, not even in England. So this made Riebeck a sort of a pioneer. Now, during his travels in Chittagong, Riebeck acquired hundreds of ethnological exhibits and zoological specimens. He took numerous anthropometric measurements of native men and women. He made plaster cast of the inhabitants' face and the feet. He recorded a number of meteorological observations and took photographs of the various tribes that he met. Now, on his return, the anthropological data concerning the measurements of different body parts, skin, complexion, skull size, form of the face was scientifically analyzed by Rudolf Virchow, who was a pathologist and the founder of the first anthropological society here in Berlin. Now, in the account of his journey to Chittagong, Riebeck described his enormous difficulty in finding a reliable interpreter. He talks about his hardships in the wake of cholera outbreak in the district and the revolt of the local Lushai tribe against the British. He also shares his disappointment in losing out in negotiations for precious tribal heirlooms and his meeting with the chief of the Pakhoma tribe, and his joy in a chance encounter with a Bengali garrison physician who was an avid reader of German books on medicine. Now, in all his travel notes, he also reveals how, on multiple occasions in the famine-torn regions, cultural relics which would have ordinarily been procured only for a large sum of money was very easily secured by him in exchange of a handful of rice and at other times a bottle of brandy. Now, when money was demanded, Riebeck repeatedly declined to make purchases, deeming the requested amount as prohibitive. Furthermore, he justified his actions by expressing concerns over the tribe's naivete and their lack of financial prudence, which would ensure that the money would then land into the pockets of the blood-sucking Bengali dealers. Now, as Riebeck directed his clinical gaze and scientific precision to measure and photograph his ethnographic subjects, there was more than just the European gaze on the other at work, as it can be discerned from Riebeck's own writings. So this is what he wrote in his diary. It was interesting to notice the harmless curiosity with which the Lushais, who are the local tribes, observed us at breakfast. Men, women, and children never varied studying our movements and demeanor. They were especially excited at our fair complexion, a proof of how rarely they were visited by Europeans. But when I began to wash my arms and chest, they pressed close round and even tore off my shirt in order to subject my body to a more searching scrutiny. Now, Riebeck's travels to India fit neatly into the wider trope of a 19th century expeditionary culture. The essence of a scientific expedition lay in the systematic collecting and dissemination of all kinds of data, which was both quantitative and in material form. Now, Riebeck's task, therefore, was not simply to make vast acquisitions of the material objects of the places he visited, but he was required to make what was called an organized scientific inquiry that would yield information useful to metropolitan or German science and ethnology. Now, collecting had to be accompanied by extensive documentation that would appropriately describe the context and the use of the acquired material. Now, scientific expeditions such as Riebeck's traditionally generated also a sense of triumphalism and perpetuated the myth of the explorer as a hero. Now, even today, both the expedition and the collections that generated from it are conventionally referred to by the name of their well-known leaders. Now, this obscures the social as well as the economic character of collecting practices, which is often reliant on a group of interpreters, collectors, local guides, and observers. Now, what kind of collecting was Riebeck required to do when he was commissioned as a traveler by the Ethnological Museum in Berlin? Now, to answer this question requires an account of a brief account of the anthropological vision of the director of the Berlin Museum, who was Adolf Bastian. I think I forgot to put a photo of him, but let's imagine him as an old man with a beard. Now, the instructions for collecting prepared by Bastian, who was a physicist and a natural scientist for the travelers sent out by the museum, were guided by his desire to explore the total history of humankind using scientific objective methods. So I'm going to just very briefly, quickly summarize what his large theories were. So bear with me. Now, Bastian believed that beneath the veneer of differences in thoughts and behaviors of people across cultures, there existed what he called a psychic unity of humankind. Now, his goal was to unravel this empirical laws of the human mind and understand the commonality that was shared by people across time and space. Okay. Now, in order to realize his project, he wanted to gather as much data as possible to understand the emergence of people's worldviews. Now, Bastian thought that the basic elementary ideas were more likely to be visible in what he called simpler, primitive societies than culturally advanced societies, owing to an absence of complex cultural patterns and social institutions in simpler societies, which were responsible for speedy transmission of culture. So he believed that one of the significant ways to acquire an impression of the people's spirit, which was the Volksgeist, was to examine and compare objects produced and used by different groups of people. Now, the procurement of raw material in the form of ethnic object was therefore, according to him, the first and the most urgent need in ethnology. So that is his vision. Now, in his quest to acquire material culture that would support his project, he insisted on the acquisition of average specimens of primitive cultures. So he was interested only in simple average specimens, and he explicitly advised travelers not to be dazzled by extraordinary objects, which, according to the earlier style of curiosity chambers, would appear suitable only for hanging up as trophies. Right? Now, to expedite things, he built a network of individuals who collected on behalf of the Berlin museums as contracted travelers. So Riebeck was one such traveler commissioned by the museum, and he was funded by a Hilfs committee whose members comprised of wealthy men, often who were Bastian's friends and supporters. Now, okay. So now, what happens now when these objects have been collected and they are now in Berlin? Now, upon arrival, the collection of Riebeck and his team was not exhibited at the Museum of Ethnology, which at that time was still under construction. So collecting had already started. They were already really, there was a collecting frenzy, but the museum, the new building was not yet prepared. So instead, the scientific collection was exhibited at the Museum of Decorative Arts, which was next door, adjacent to the Museum of Ethnology, where, as you can see, it evoked a visually dense image of a magnificent oriental bazaar with piles of objects mounted, hung and placed on tables and shelves. So it was only 5 years later that the collection was then exhibited at the newly inaugurated Museum of Ethnology, where a scientific method of display, classification, comparison, pioneered by Adolf Bastian, was executed. Now, in large So this is the museum building from the outside. Now in large light-filled halls, objects were kept in cabinets made of glass and thin iron frames. These cabinets were stacked in parallel rows and arranged in a fishbone pattern in the center of the floor. Now such an arrangement made the contents of several cabinets simultaneously available to the gaze of the visitor, thereby prompting a comparative study between diverse specimens. Now, as objects were transported from colonial periphery to metropolitan museums, such as in Berlin, their transformation into ethnological objects was also accomplished by their acquisition numbers, their hand-printed labels, which were also occasionally supplemented with photographs, maps, charts, and diagrams. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, they are displayed, they are put into cabinets, but like how were they read, how were they interpreted? Okay, so I'm going to quickly rush now. I wanted to talk a little bit about the hierarchies that were at play. Now, ethnographic collections have since long been associated with the examination of only non-European societies, while art and history collections have focused on material culture of Europe. But I want to look beyond this binary because it did not also strictly operate as such within the ethnological collections of Berlin. So several objects from Europe were also seen as ethnographic. Now this include prehistorical antiquities from Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Russia, Austro-Hungary, and parts of Germany as well, because they were considered so because they had developed independently of the Oriental and classical cultures and were untouched by Christianity. Similarly, art from Near East, which was West Asia and especially the Egyptian Nile Valley, were never the focus of ethnographic research. So artifacts from ancient Egypt and Babylon, as we know, were always looked as antiquities which were at par with Greek and Roman classical art. So therefore, to say that the study of all ethnographic material was simply to demonstrate the advancement of Europe while testifying to the primitiveness of non-Europe would be a very simplistic framework to grasp the complex political formation that was facilitated by such systems of classification. Moreover, what it does, it runs the danger of overlooking internal hierarchies which operated within these ethnological collections. So I don't have much time, but I'm just going to quickly talk about, now in the ethnological collections also, there were two sets of hierarchies, so to say. One is Naturvölker, which is can be kind of translated as primitive societies, which was of Africa, Oceania, modern America, and Kulturfolk, which is cultural people, so culturally advanced people of East Asia, India, and ancient America. Now, so I'm not going to go into reasons why this India was classified as Kulturfolk, but let me skip that. So now even though India was classified as Kulturfolk, so they were only included in the scope of ethnology only because they were not included in what was called the domain of world history, right? So as a result, their inclusion in ethnology was written as only temporary and as a provisional step until they found place in world history. So within the supposed, the twofold divisions of humanity as cultural Europe and primitive non-Europe, the position of India was ambivalent at best. So even though the material culture of India, as Bastian himself put it, bore a more cultural historical appearance than that of the average ethnological collections, they were displayed and examined through the lens of ethnology. Now, even within India, Okay. So this is a map of India. Despite the classification of India as Kulturfolk, Bastian was aware that there were diverse layers of ethnological material, right? Including that of the natural tribes. Now, Bastian assigned a permanent place in ethnology to the aboriginal tribes of central India and the primitive people of the Himalayas, which is the brown color, that's the Himalayan belt. So they were classified as primitive, and the region of Deccan. So yeah, what color is it? But yeah, the beige. Yeah, okay. So they, according to Bastian, these were the primitive areas even within a cultural land of India. Now, such hierarchies were reflected in the system of classification and arrangement at the Ethnological Museum. The museum's collection were geographically displayed, and the collections were from India were all placed together on the second floor. Now, within that, what was called Indian collection, there were 3 subsidiary groups. I'm going to just quickly summarize that. It was called Fordea Indian, which was roughly South Asia. There's Hinter Indian, which is the present day mainland Southeast Asia. And the third was the Indian archipelago, which included the islands of Indonesia and Philippines. But this was all considered as India, right? Now, when Riebeck's collection came into the museum, they were exhibited, most of his objects were exhibited as a part of Fordea India, which is just South Asia, right? While the collections from Chittagong, which is of the tribal collection, were placed in a room adjoining this, which was reserved for the primitive people of the Himalayas, right? Now, even within the Fordea Indian collection, there were classifications that illustrated imagined ethno-linguistic and racial divisions in India. First, of the high-born people of Aryan descent from the Indo-Gangetic plains, so the green part, who spoke idioms developed from Sanskrit. Then the lower caste Dravidians, mainly in the south and southeast regions, or what is the Deccan Plateau, and use Dravidian languages. And lastly, the wild tribes of central India. Now, the selection of material that was put on display emphasized ethnic objects such as ethnic objects belonging to the wild tribes and the lower caste over archaeological materials such as Buddhist sculptures, right? Because ethnology was more concerned with primitive societies. There was also a map that oriented visitors to the linguistic and racial divisions of India as people of Aryan descent, Dravidian descent, what was called Kolarians, which were the central tribes from central India, and the people of Himalaya and Tibet, which were more closely associated to East Asia. So these all divisions were what was displayed. Stacks of objects, I'm just concluding in a minute, yes. Stack of objects were transformed into lessons that would reveal the level of barbarity or the degree of civilization achieved by the various communities. For example, model of houses built by the inhabitants of Nicobar Islands illustrated how they were less crude than the Andamanese tribe, who in turn, with their black, I quote, black, dwarfish, hairless and naked bodies exhibited the lowest level of culture. Archaeological objects such as Gandharan Buddha represented the ancient Apollo idol in the east and were seen as perfect illustrations of the Aryan type of art. So instead of focusing, I want to look at how these internal hierarchies were created. And there were, of course, complex reasons of why and where these race theories or these kind of divisions emerged. But I'm not going to go into that. My time is up. I just want to leave with a couple of questions. That is, what are the implications of such cultural and epistemological hierarchies that are created by such systems of classification today as we view, order and interpret our worlds? And how can the knowledge of these hierarchies benefit us today in the process of museum decolonization for a more equitable future?
Thank you so much, Dalit. It was really powerful. A lot of takeaways from what you presented, and one of the crucial points is, as you concluded, the internal hierarchy is fantastic. We need to understand that what was selected. The Aryan component is very interesting. Just quickly, another work came to my mind by the Sanskritist called Johannes Broncos. It's titled as How the Brahmins Won. And in that, suddenly I think around 130 page or something, he does something interesting. How Hitler here in the 1920s was establishing museums to celebrate the Greco-Roman great culture of Germans. Even as in the 1920s and 30s, Germany was far ahead in modern technology. So on the one hand, you museumize, your Greco-Roman. So Johannes Broncos says Hitler was trying to establish that kind of ancient past glory. On the other hand, Germany was heading towards modernity in a radical way. That's one thing. So that's it. So from there, when I was reading Johannes Broncos, I was wondering, to connect with India, the interconnections between Brahminism and Nazism, the symbols, we have not done that. I think we need to create projects on that. Why a Brahmin is obsessed with Vedic history, fabricated, caste-oriented, divided, bodily mutilated. I teach Manodharma Shastra, therefore I'm saying 11 body parts could be cut. So how Manodharma Shastra could be a religious text, probably the most notorious religious text, anti-human religious text in the world. Anti-disability is the most notorious dehumanizing invention of the world. It comes from India. So museumization and so on, this interconnectivity is important. And I'm glad you are touching that the internal hierarchies, the Aryanization, like you said, the connection between Nazism and Aryanization is very important for me. I think all of us need to grapple with. So brilliant. So thank you. We leave it at that, and good luck with your research. You are a fantastic one. Thank you. Okay, now we are on to a research scholar called Vinil Paul. He has a PhD. Vinil, come on, please. He has got a PhD from JNU, Government University, New Delhi, in history. And the most important thing is about all of us have studied in English. We've, battled with the archives and so on. Vinil has published in Malayalam about slavery. That's amazing. So I am one of the very strong proponents now in South Asian studies to take vernacular history seriously in people's own languages. Okay, so right now in England and the US, you go to India Office Library in London and to dig out the history of the oppressed. And people will come back and say, sorry sir, there is no document. Okay, there is no history about them. That is a shitty situation we are in. Right? You don't find the document in the India Office Library, therefore no history of the oppressed of Indians. In contrast, I think research scholars like Vinil Paul will tell, no, look at our Malayalam, look at our Bundelkhandi, look at our Rajasthani, we've been producing, we've been publishing. So it has to be documented and people's languages should be taken seriously. So the vernacular reconstruction of South Asia is a big field. Most of the South Asians are so sadly missing these local languages. We come from those languages. We grew up in our mother tongues. We had to struggle with English to master it in our colleges. The language I picked up in my college. Where to put A, where to put an. Imagine reaching Columbia to get a PhD. Every bloody step was a blood-sucking moment. So, but we have our mother tongues, we should be taken seriously. I think that's what Vinil Paul, even though he's got a PhD from JNU, one of the top universities in the world, in English, and yet he is publishing in Malayalam. So it's a rare historian, and thankfully Sajan Mani is collaborating with him. So I think interdisciplinarians they are. We all have to be interdisciplinaries to grapple with questions of race, caste, and gender. So it's truly an honor to have Vinil Paul here. So Vinil, go ahead. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you for this opportunity. First, I would like to say about my language because my English is very poor, so maybe I need a translator. I wish to read my paper because now the TV newsreaders as my role model, so I start to my read. My title is Life's Discrimination and Visual Representation of Dalits in Colonial Southwest India. We know there are numerous academic and popular studies dealing with the contributions made by the European companies and their interventions in the social, economic, cultural, and religious life of lower caste, especially Dalits in 19th century Kerala. A group of scholars explored the history of European Christian missionary activities among the Dalits. So they asked why Dalits embraced the European Christianity. We know Dr. Sanal Mohan's work is in that context. A lot of studies are there in this area. Many of the early investigations argued that the passion for material benefit and the acquisition of new traditions drew lower caste towards the new religion of Christianity. A group of economic historians or labor historians were engaged in the history of colonial labor policies, and they explored the transformation of labor structures. I try to say a group of historians focused in the Protestant Christian mission area. The another group of scholars were focused the labor structure and the colonial transformation of labor caste and how the caste and labor connected and what are the transformations in that area. We know the different school of thoughts have problematic the concept of slavery and the labor in the Indian context. We know the great debate in the context of the slavery was existed in India or not. Especially the Marxist historians were more interested to interpret in that area. The another scholars were interested to explore the history of plantation sector and the agricultural changes in colonial Kerala. Also, there has been a rich historiographical debate on the emergence of plantation sector under the supervision of Europeans. Other group of scholars were more interested to interpret and explore the roots of colonial modernity agencies like the modern education history and the English education history, printing press, etc., etc. The majority of the historical narrations were engaged in the life of Dalits in the colonial era. At the same time, the existing studies did not properly address the pictorial representation of Dalits or the lower caste in colonial photography. From this historiographical vantage point, this paper tried to demonstrate and argue that colonial photographs are one of the important source material for the recollecting lower caste past. So I try to say the caste background of the Kerala society. Caste, slavery and untouchability are the major social institutions in Kerala's ancient and medieval society. The transaction of a slave was a legally established relationship involving the several mechanisms and institutions. And Kerala society was divided and arranged based on the caste in a hierarchical order that ranged from the sacred to untouchable, or from Brahmin to Pulaya or Paraya. We know the funny thing is that the Pulayas claim to they were the upper, and at the same time Parayas will try to say about we are the upper class. The caste sociologists have noted that Kerala's caste practices and discrimination were comparatively very oppressive and different from other parts of India. The caste ranking and hierarchy in Kerala closely resembled sociological ideal typical conceptions of the Hindu caste hierarchy. Almost every caste group in given Hindu village of the region is said to occupy So I try to say we know the caste was one of the major institutions in India. At the same time, Malayalis people, especially the Kerala people, caste history and caste practice was entirely different from other parts of India, because we know in other parts in India there is the hierarchy is Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. In the Kerala's caste structure, there is no Kshatriya and Vaishya. there is Brahmin is there, and then the second layer and third layer is not there. Then Shudra is there, and a lot of untouchable castes are there. The unapproachability is the another difference in Kerala's history. Unapproachability was the unique to the caste formation and pollution norms in Kerala caste society. In other words, ritual or caste pollution, which in the rest of India was transmitted only by touch, could in Kerala be communicated over distance. An upper caste man, seeing a man of the slave caste 100 yards away, would consider himself polluted and undergo a series of purificatory ceremonies. In the caste-ridden Kerala society, the various injunctions imposed on social relations stipulated that the lower caste should not approach the higher caste and they should stay beyond the prescribed distance. Accordingly, the lower caste people, wherever they go, give notice of their coming by uttering a particular cry at every 4 or 5 paces. If by accident they should be there, I perceive an upper caste Brahmin or Nair at distance, they must instantly make a loud howling to warn her or him from approaching until they have returned or climbed up the nearest tree. The caste rule regulating the distance is follow. A Nair, one of the upper caste in Kerala, an upper caste Hindu may be approached but not touch a Brahmin. And Irava, one of the now they known as the OBC caste, and Irava must remain 36 passes off, and a Pulaya 96 steps distant at Irava must remain 12 steps away from Nair. A Syrian Christian, Christians and Mapala Muslims are the another important presence in Kerala history. And the interesting factor is that they were keep the caste discrimination, and they owned slaves, and they were the major slave agents in the Kerala history. This kind of caste practice was strictly followed by the all section of people. The evangelical missionaries reported a number of cruel incidents taking place on account of violation of caste restrictions. Even after the abolition of slavery in 1855, such cruel oppressive restrictions continued and unabated in Travancore and Kochi. Ethnographic account of the CMS missionaries gave several narratives of such cruelties. CMS and LMS, Church Mission Society and the London Mission Society, were the important mission, evangelical mission movement actively worked there. So they collected a lot of this kind of information, and also they collected some photographs. For instance, a CMS missionary, A.F. Painter, reported on 9 April 1883 that he saw a brutal assault of the Pulaya man by a Nair. Because of this, Pulaya man did not follow the distance rule. Painter further referred to the incident of a brutal murder of a Pulaya by a Vajar caste. All the castes strictly followed the distance rule, and it was an important law of Kerala society. In the first half of the 20th century, we come across a number of such incidents, even photographs also. When a fisherman wished to sell his fish to a soldier, he placed it in the middle of the road, some 20 or 25 feet far away. When the bargaining is over, the soldier takes up the fish, leaving the money in its stead. This is one of the important photograph in this context. CMS missionary W.S. Khan, he took these photos in central Travancore area. This is the practice of the how to lower caste people purchasing some material from the shops. So they keep the distance. This is this photo is taken from 1924. W.S. Khan described the context of this photograph. During an afternoon drive in Travancore, come upon a group of people whom we now recognize as outcasts. A dozen of them, some standing and some squatting, are in the middle of the road, facing a very humble shop. In its open front, various wares were displayed, chiefly comestible rice, chilies, plants, etc. The shopkeeper lolls against the doorpost, preparing a show of betel and chatting with the 2 or 3 friends. His wife is bathing her laminating and kicking baby in arachnut spot beside the well. Her little daughter is washing a cooking pot. From the time one or other group on the road calls out in an whining tone, occasionally the shopkeeper tosses a scornfully reply, and the dog crawled up at his feet, utters a low groan. The outcast people are would-be purchasers, and a bargain is in process of being struck between them and the shopkeeper. At length, it's completed. The outcast deposits a few coins on the road and back away. The shopkeeper comes leisurely forward, pick up the coins, put down in their place the articles bargained for, and returns to his shop. Then the purchasers at once take up their purchase with the muttered grumblings at their smallness. This is another photograph. It's also taken from WSL. It's taken 1990. It was published in one of the CMS mission journals, CMS Gleaner. 3 pulayas are standing in a rice field, 80 yards from a high road, out of pollution distance of passing high caste Hindu. It's also taken from the Tiruvalla in central Kerala. This is also from the South India. It's not from Kerala. This is the practice of how to give water to the lower caste people. All the section of people fear the caste pollution. No one allowed slave caste to draw water from their wells, fearing pollution. Once a well is polluted, to purify it, they throw a burning coals and red hot brass. These kind of restrictions were the backbone of the caste hierarchy in Kerala, and it strengthened the power of the upper caste. The Kerala people's dwelling system was also totally linked with their work and caste laws. Francis Buchanan, one of the early British officer, and he reported, Francis Buchanan noted that the huts of the slave caste were little better than the large basket. They were discouraged from having comfortable huts in order that they might be willing to move about as required for the work of cultivation. They lived together in the fields and out parts adjacent to the village. So, what is the importance of these photographs? Here, this is the important question of this context. With the support of the colonial photographs, we can explain the common characteristics and experience of slave caste in colonial Kerala. Most of the European sources observed that the Kerala slave caste was the most oppressed group in the whole of history. They lived in a very bad conditions everywhere in Kerala. Colonial photos are necessary to understand the social transformation of the Dalit community in Kerala, which will be very helpful to understand the Kerala's caste practice. The lower caste people were totally marginalized from all sections of society. At the same time, colonial photographs show the life of upper caste people. I mean, the colonial photograph will help to understand the discrimination among the local people. We also get a lot of images of Nair families and Tharwad, etc., etc. It's very so we can easily to understand the 19th or 20th century discrimination with the help of the colonial photograph. Finally, these colonial photographs help to understand the Eurocentric concept of colonial regime. So I try to say the Kerala Dalit people or Dalit researchers have two aim. First, with the help of these photographs, first we will try to criticize the caste regime or the caste Savarna people's life. Then second is we try to criticize the Eurocentric or the European concept of the society or their photographic imaginations. Thank you.
I think every state like you were doing about Kerala, I think every state, the pictures about the constabulary communities, how the collusion between the colonialists and the privileged caste groups, I think it's a very important field. This has to be unraveled. And I think in a way, Bill Paul is beginning that work. It should be an inspiration to deal with every country. And interestingly, in July we had a conference at Göttingen University where I was part of this. And next year there's going to be a volume on Tamils and Germans connection. And interestingly, I went to the archives in Halle. It's a very long, interesting history. So there are Germans books that were produced in the 1750s with clear romanticization of Brahmins. So I found out those materials. I'm just sharing it with you. Please try your own way of researching it. Literally celebrating the Brahmins and reproducing caste oppression by the German historians. And I also have some photographs, notorious photographs of the Indians who were categorized as pariahs by the German photographers. You can't see them. And I'm going to get them published next year through a concept that I'm introducing called Brahminical Scialism. Scialism is pretending to be a scholar, pretending to be a knowledge person, while I'm actually fabricating. That is Scialism. So Brahminical Scialism. So I literally refute and question everything that you call as Brahminical is basically a fabrication. Therefore, I'm calling it Brahminical Scialism. Now, how this Brahminical Scialism was mimicked by Europeans, Germans were not free from it. It's very important. I think Paul is nudging us to think about it. The second point that he said, the Eurocentric views, the second point that he said. And then, how the privileged groups themselves sold themselves to the Europeans. So, as of now, I tracked down to the early 17th century, the word Brahminism was circulating in Europe by the Protestant missionaries, Dutch and other missionaries, British missionaries who were getting back from India in the early 17th century. 1620s is the time that I figured out the word Brahminism was getting popularized in Europe. 1620s. So which means the Protestant missionaries fell for the Brahminical Scialism. Brahminical Scialism. And they screwed us for long thereafter. 95%, 5% are only Brahmins. 95% of others, you guys don't know about. A Kshatriya wouldn't say like that. A Vaishya wouldn't say like that. A Shudra wouldn't say like that. Only a Brahmin would breastbeat and say, I am a Brahmin. And we've been circulating that in South Asian studies shamelessly. Okay, so, and that's what I think these archives that Vinil Paul is touching up, writing in his own Malayalam, that's more powerful than his English contribution that we all have to break our heads with to unravel. Every region has to be done that way. So thank you, Vinil, for bringing our attention to that. Congratulations for doing this work. Okay, good. So right now I think we'll stop here. I'd like to I have some questions that we can discuss later. But if you guys have some questions, we have to wind up very quickly. Be precise with your questions. You can raise to any of the panelists, and I think we'll have probably some 15 minutes or so. Then we have to jump to another venue. We'll try to cover as much as possible. Please post your questions. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself, and we would love to hear your name.
My name is Abhishek. My question is, in all this, all the panel, all the conversations that you presented, where do you see, like, because we were talking about wake up call to the ancestors and celebration of those, not oppressions and not just highlighting that, but also celebrating things that are beyond that. And where do you see the role of someone like Narayana Guru and Ayyangari here, like in this context as well, if you could touch upon that?
This is to anybody in particular?
Anyone.
Anyone, okay. So the role of Narayana Guru and Ayyangari, how do they fit into this wake-up call for my ancestors? Very, I think, an interesting question. Thank you, Abhishek. Anybody? Professor Sir, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, Abhishek, thank you very much. I shall be very brief. I think when Sajan thought about this whole idea of wake-up call, I mean, actually, last month that Kerala public domain had celebrated, the most important days in the lives of Narayana Guru and Ayyappa. And there were a lot of discussions about their contributions, etc. Now, what I would suggest is that Narayana Guru and Ayyappa, both of them represented in many ways modernist turn of Kerala society. That's how I look at it. I look at them. While the difference is that, as you would also know, perhaps Narayana Guru then drew on this, traditional knowledges. He was a Advaita Vedanti and quite well learned in Sanskrit, Tamil, Siddha, and all such traditions. So one could think of him as, in a way, a traditional scholar also because of his knowledge in these domains. Now, Iyengar has a different take on this. He was not a Sanskritist, and because he was from the southern part of Kerala, it's quite likely that he knew Tamil, but all his public statements, etc., unless translated into English and published, were in Malayalam. So those English stuff we have in the publications of the government of Kerala, particularly the proceedings of the Popular Assembly, is where his speeches are printed in English. And I have argued elsewhere that Iyengar was a modernist person. He had nothing to do with all this traditional stuff, temple entry and all this, because it remains as a very controversial thing because of the ascendancy of the current regime at the center. RSS and BJP would love to see this man as a harbinger of some kind of Hinduism to the untouchables. And they do highlight some aspects of his life where he had a conversation with some of those upper caste Christians who wanted to some sections of the Koreas in Kutanad region to the church. And those debates are quite famous, but Iyengar's contentious position was not because of Christianity, but because of the fact that one section of untouchables becoming Christians would mean that it would diminish the bargaining power of this oppressed caste. So, they would get dissipated on religious grounds, and therefore he was opposed to that. Per se, he was not opposed to religion or Korea's becoming Christians because you can restrain because within his organization you find that as leaders a number of Dalit Christians from Korea communities, and one segment of his family again became LMS Christians, and they are still there in Trivandrum, many of them. But so this was a different kind of thing. Now, wake up call, I guess. I think it does an entirely different kind of function. Now, these figures are important, but when you really look at this question of archives, writing critical histories, and so on, while we acknowledge the initial movements led by all these people, even they are to be, waken up from. We need to awake them as well from a certain kind of appropriation that is happening now. So therefore, it's a multiple kind of intervention that, in fact, our friend Sajan is performing here. We shouldn't stop with that project of Srinarayan Guru and Iyengar, but we include them in this wake-up call. And then, as I said, this modernist thing. So how to move forward? That is the whole thing. And where we need a critical intervention because they are prone to appropriation and. It takes a long while, but I just cut short by saying that if you look at the biographies of Iyengar, which are in circulation today, So every political segment has got its own kind of biography of Iyengar. So that's the funny thing. And whereas in the case of Sriharanaguru, the dominant section of Yeravas believed that he was a Hindu. So much of it is against sort of histories for which, if you think about the history of this movement, it goes against the grain of what both these people represent. So therefore, I think this wake-up call is for them as well, to sort of, I'm not saying that we are going to retrieve them, but we are going to critically engage with their ideas. This is how I look at it. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Any more questions?